This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Jill Newbronner. Here are tonight's top stories. Pope Francis, head of the Roman Catholic Church, has died at the age of 88, a day after making an appearance at St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday. World leaders have offered condolences and tributes to remember the pontiff's leadership. China and Indonesia hold their first ever joint diplomacy and defense talks in the Chinese capital, Beijing calling on Jakarta to oppose all forms of unilateralism and trade protectionism. China also hitting out at other countries making trade deals with the US. Asia's top economy warns against countermeasures to appease Washington. South Korea finds Chinese goods worth millions of dollars relabelled to be rerouted to the US in a bid to sidestep hefty tariffs. And another troubling development in China's $3.7 trillion shadow banking industry, with one more state-owned lender seeking government help. But first, Pope Francis, the first non-European pontiff in more than a millennia, has died. The 88-year-old passed away this morning.
Carissimi fratelli e sorelle, con profondo dolore devo annunciare la morte del nostro Santo Padre Francesco. Alle ore 7:35 di questa mattina, il Vescovo di Roma Francesco è tornato alla casa del Padre. La sua vita tutta intera è stata dedicata al servizio del Signore e della sua Chiesa.
He made his final public appearance yesterday, greeting thousands of worshippers gathered at the Vatican for Easter Sunday Mass. Pope Francis was elected in 2013 and was the first Latin American leader of the Roman Catholic Church. He spent his final years in and out of hospital, most recently hospitalized for 5 weeks in Rome for double pneumonia in mid-February. Tributes are pouring in with the passing of Pope Francis. Taiwan has sent condolences, saying it will send envoys of the appropriate level to the funeral. The Vatican is one of only 12 countries to maintain formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi lauds the legacy of the late pontiff, saying he will always be remembered as a beacon of compassion, humility, and spiritual courage by millions across the world. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas described him as a faithful friend of the Palestinian people. Spain's Prime Minister hailed Pope Francis's commitment to peace, social justice, and the most vulnerable, adding that he leaves behind a profound legacy. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni described the late pontiff as a great man and shepherd. French President Emmanuel Macron calling him a man of humility who was on the side of the most vulnerable and fragile. The EU chief Ursula von der Leyen remembered the late Pope's pure humility and love of the less fortunate. Now, moving on to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, he hailed Pope Francis a man of reconciliation, while the Dutch Prime Minister called the late pontiff a man of the people who recognized and called attention to the burning issues of our day. The Church of England's most senior cleric praised the late Pope's desire to lead and build the Church in new ways. Well, let's take a look back at Pope Francis's time as head of the Catholic Church.
This is the moment the world met Pope Francis in 2013, who asked his followers to pray for him as he took on his new role and new identity. He was born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1936 to Italian immigrants. Ordained into the priesthood in 1969, Bergoglio rose through the ranks to become Archbishop of Buenos Aires.
Ed era una figura molto originale, ero molto incuriosito.
Lucio Brunelli is a journalist who first met then Cardinal Bergoglio in 2005. 2 days after the papal conclave in 2013, Brunelli got a surprise phone call.
Fui presa alla sprovvista, poi insomma tutta la tensione di quei giorni e ebbi un momento di grande commozione, non riuscivo a parlare, mi scusai, dico mi scusi, santità. E non posso dimenticare la sua risposta perché dice molto di come è fatto lui. Lui rimase assolutamente tranquillo, disse no ma non ti preoccupare Lucio, finisci pure, io ti aspetto, ti devo dire una cosa.
That personal touch seemed to run through everything he did, calling out indifference to the plight of migrants, insisting that homosexuality is not a crime, or warning that climate change affects the poorest in society first.
Che è un papa latinoamericano ma con radici europee, perché il padre partì nel 1928 da Genova in nave per arrivare in Argentina e quindi ha vissuto l'esperienza di essere prima generazione di un popolo di emigranti e questo gli ha dato una particolare sensibilità rispetto a certi temi. L'altro è che guarda alla Chiesa non con una prospettiva eurocentrica.
That global vision was also reflected in his 11-day tour of Asia and Oceania in 2024, taking in Indonesia, Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste before wrapping up in Singapore. It was the longest trip of his entire papacy. Throughout, the aging pontiff urged his followers to embrace interfaith harmony, insisting that religions are simply different languages to arrive at God. But like any world leader, Pope Francis leaves behind a mixed legacy. He explicitly criminalized sexual abuse under Vatican law and issued apologies for abuse scandals around the world. Survivor groups, though, said there was still a lack of accountability in the higher echelons of the Church. In the end, the world will perhaps remember Pope Francis for his approach to the papacy rather than his results. A pope who was quick with a joke but never quick to judge, who shunned the lavish trappings of his office for a simpler life, the people's pope.
Pope Francis's visit to Asia last year marked a significant moment for many, with observers noting the lasting impact it had on pressing issues in the region. CNA's Leong Wai-kit reports.
This was one of the venues where Pope Francis held Mass during his Asia-Pacific tour in 2024. But apart from having made an impact on Catholics in the region, the pontiff also paved the way to improve issues socially, politically, and on regional crises.
Since becoming the head of the Catholic Church in 2013, Pope Francis sought to bring more attention to Asia, a continent which observers say the Vatican must not lose sight of as it becomes more central in global affairs. Those efforts include increasing the number of cardinals from Asia and more trips to the region.
When it comes to Asia, he has solved, or at least deeply improved, relationship with China. The synodality reform that he pushed for Asia, it's crucial because in a world deeply marked by colonization, where the church in Asia has been also marked by colonization, pushing for synodality, saying that the governance of the church comes through mutual listening, where we all equally explain and share through prayer and listening our concerns for the church. That's quite a revolution in some parts of the universal church, but also in Asia.
Among the Pope's most significant trips was his Asia-Pacific tour in 2024. 4 countries, 11 days, and his longest trip. And it was extra meaningful for Timor-Leste. The country's road to independence is closely tied to the Catholic Church, which offered protection to its people when it was occupied by Indonesia.
The role of the Catholic Church in Timor has a historic role in our independence struggle. His visit actually has put Timor-Leste on the map. It shows that although we are a small country, we have a lot of challenges, but we still managed to host His Holiness in our country for those few days that he was there.
Hosting the Pope was a chance for Timor-Leste to prove its capability to hold large-scale events, one of the criteria it must fulfill to become an official member of ASEAN. Domestically, it's trying to lift its people from poverty, a point Pope Francis made during his visit.
With the Pope's visit, I think it gives our leaders instill that sense of urgency that we must do more to pull our people out of poverty. In fact, our national development plan spells it very clearly that by 2030, we would like to have eradicated poverty.
In the Jakarta leg of the Pope's visit, terror threats were made against him, highlighting a perennial issue in the region. Yet the visit proceeded with Pope Francis and Indonesia's Grand Imam promoting interfaith harmony, a move that experts say was a step in the right direction.
I would say that interfaith dialogues, interfaith interactions between leaders of various communities, religious communities, very, very important, particularly for the wider communities who are trying to make sense of all the problems in the world, all the challenges, the disputes, the conflicts between various religious groups. So trying to understand what is happening and what their role should be. So when they see the positive promotion of interfaith accommodation, between the Pope and the Imam in Indonesia, for example, that sends a very powerful message, and it will be effective.
As the Catholic Church closes one chapter with Pope Francis and begins another, observers are sure of one thing: the momentum Pope Francis pushed for to focus on Asia is on track to continue.
And for more, we're joined by Dr. Michel Chambon. He is a research fellow from a Religion and Globalization Cluster Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Dr. Chambon, thank you for joining us. We heard you earlier and your comments on the Pope's impact in Asia. Expand for us on what his legacy might be in the Catholic Church, but also the world.
So, thank you so much for having me. So yes, we are all shocked and surprised by the sudden departure of the Pope. We also yesterday him joining the Easter celebration, and today is gone. In terms of legacy, clearly the Pope will be remembered for his very, very strong engagements for the marginalized people. From the beginning, his first international trip was in Lampedusa, a tiny island, for migrants. He really insisted a lot on migrants. His last major trip was in Southeast Asia, visiting all kinds of countries that sometimes are forgotten.
Now, he was seen by some as being a revolutionary pope for the way he handled some sensitive issues. Tell me about that, and how do you think that characteristic will set the tone for the next pope, perhaps?
Well, in terms of internal politics of the Catholic Church, he was a reformer. I don't know if revolutionary is the right term, but clearly he was a reformer. He worked with a group of cardinals for more than 8 years to reform the constitution of the Holy See. But then, after this first round of internal reform, he also launched a major process of consultation that we call the Synod on Synodality, that he recently, a few weeks ago, announced that this process has to continue for the next 3 years. And that's another form of reform that is not a top-down authority inside the Catholic Church, but a more inclusive, horizontal ways of including everybody. So that for sure, he was a reformer of the Catholic Church. That will stay.
Explain for us what's next in a process that follows the death of the Pope. What happens now?
So we expect probably today or tomorrow the Vatican, the Carmelengo, to announce the exact date of the funeral. I wouldn't be surprised if it's Friday or Saturday. Then we respect about 9 days, 10 days of mourning and reflecting, giving thanks and prayers and meditation on the legacy of Pope Francis. Of course, during that time, and in about maximum 3 weeks from today, but something between 2 weeks and 3 weeks from today, we will see the conclave opening. So which means that all the cardinals of the world more than 200 of them, are inviting to Rome, and those below 80-year-old, so about 136, will gather and start the election process.
Now, in the past, the funerals at the Vatican have been one of the largest gatherings of diplomats as well as world leaders, along with the faithful. Do you expect an event of that scale this time round?
Yes, for sure. For sure, we will see all world leaders there. He's been extremely engaged in world politics. He's been pushing very hard to build peace, to criticize the World War III in pieces that we are living in today with so many conflicts. And I think that for the past 2 months, having a silent Pope, battling with sickness, many people reflected on the value of his voice. So I do expect to see a massive influx of diplomats and head of state in Rome by the end of this week. I also hope to see highest level of the Chinese government coming and paying respect when we know how much progress we saw thanks to Francis in the dialogue between China and the Vatican.
Now, the process of beginning the election for the next pope is opaque to the common man. Do we have any insight into perhaps who might be thought of in that process to take over?
Of course, there are a few expectations or assumptions and discussion on this, but it's kind of impossible to tell, because the cardinals have first to assess and debate among us what is current state today, not 1 month ago, not 1 year ago, but today, what's the current state of the Catholic Church and of global affairs. So cardinals have to debate, for instance, but that's not new. What does the next Pope have to do with the synodality reform of the Catholic Church, which is a major things that Pope Francis announced it has to go for the next 3 years, so the next Pope have to work with it. Also, on the external front, they have to debate what should we do with the Trump administration, what should we do with China. So we know a number of views, and right now Pope Francis had created the vast majority of cardinals. We expect probably, but we will see in 2 weeks, probably 2 or 3 weeks from now, a Pope that will help deepen and stabilize the legacy of Francis, but we will see.
All right, we do appreciate your insight, Dr. Michel Chambon, for the Asia Research Institute at the National University of Singapore. Thank you. Coming up on East Asia tonight, China holds its first ever 2+2 dialogue with Indonesia as part of efforts to engage more with Southeast Asia amid tensions with the US. You're with East Asia tonight. Welcome back. China has warned countries against striking trade deals with the US at Beijing's expense after reports suggested that Washington is pressing its trading partners to limit trade with China in exchange for US tariff exemptions. China's Ministry of Commerce accused the US of unilateral bullying by abusing tariffs under the banner of equivalence, while forcing parties to start reciprocal tariff negotiations. It warned nations that trying to trade away the interests of others for temporary gains will backfire and will not be tolerated by Beijing. The US has imposed 10% tariffs on almost all imports, but paused country-specific levies, leaving nations scrambling to negotiate for lower duties or exemptions. US Vice President J.D. Vance is in India to hash out a trade agreement with New Delhi, while South Korea is preparing for talks with Washington this week, hoping for some reprieve for its major exports like autos and smartphones. And last week, Japan's tariff envoy met with US officials and President Donald Trump. Prime Minister Shigeru Shiba lauded the talks as a model for the world. This year alone, the US has imposed tariffs of 145% on Chinese imports, prompting Beijing to slap retaliatory duties of 125% on American goods. Mr. Trump says Washington is engaging with China on the levies. Beijing has made clear it will not engage in discussions under unfair terms and has warned it will fight the trade war to the very end. Now, the first ministerial-level talks between the foreign and defense ministers of China and Indonesia took place today. It was the first so-called 2+2 meeting of its kind between the countries. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi used the event to call on Indonesia to oppose unilateralism and trade protectionism, hinting at the need to strengthen regional integration with Southeast Asia.
我们要始终坚持开放包容、互利共赢的合作理念，反对任何形式的单边主义、贸易保护主义。认为滥施关税将严重损害各国的正常经贸往来。我们将共同致力于加快区域经济一体化进程，维护产业链、供应链稳定畅通，维护全球南方的正当合法权益。
Both sides agreed that it was important to accelerate economic integration and maintain stable industrial and supply chains. Indonesia's Foreign Minister Sugiono, who recently visited Washington, D.C. to discuss reciprocal tariffs, stressed Jakarta's commitment to boost ties with intergovernmental organizations.
We welcome the conclusion of the ASEAN-China Free Trade Agreement 3.0 and reaffirm our shared commitment to elevate the ASEAN-China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. And we will also maintain close collaboration within BRICS, G20, and the United Nations to promote multilateralism and inclusive global cooperation.
Well, let's go straight to two of our correspondents, one in Shanghai, one in Jakarta, Tan Yuguan and Saiful Bari Ismail. First to you, Yuguan, what are the countries saying this? Why are the countries saying this meeting is so important?
Well, in the words of China's foreign minister, it is significant because it is the first ministerial level 2+2 dialogue that China ever established globally, that is, defense and foreign ministers from both sides at the same table. From a geopolitical point of view, it also comes as the US and China, as you mentioned, are waging a trade war. For China, Indonesia represents an attractive destination for China's exports originally bound for the US. Now, according to an estimate compiled by the World Data Lab, it's projected that Indonesia's so-called consumer class will add 76 million people in 5 years' time. So by 2030, Indonesia would be the fourth largest consumer market after India, China, and the United States. Now, according to those projections, Indonesia will have 158 million consumers, just under half of the United States. Now, this really goes to show how big potential market Indonesia could become for China. Now, Indonesia also potentially has modest reserves of rare earths, unexplored, unrefined reserves. While China is the world's top producer of refined rare earths, China did use rare earth restrictions as part of its arsenal to retaliate against US tariffs. And rare earths is a critical mineral for producing a whole host of electronic products, from defense to consumer products. So Indonesia's modest reserves could become a wild card in the future. Most of all, it's worth noting that although defense ministers were present, their respective statements from both sides did not mention their territorial disputes in the South China Sea. The Indonesian defense minister merely noted that Jakarta would adhere to the principle of mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, and that both sides will enhance cooperation in defense and maritime security to safeguard regional peace and stability. Now, the two sides also agreed to cooperate in infrastructure building, minerals development, and joint security. Now, the last part is quite significant because Indonesia has concerns over China's development near the Natuna Islands. Now, it really goes to show that both sides is willing to set aside their overlapping South China Sea territorial claims to cooperate on other things in the meantime. Jill?
Thanks, Yuguan. Now, Saiful, you heard Yuguan saying that Indonesia is a massive market. So where will Indonesia put its chips? Will it increasingly align its trade and investment strategy with China amid the US tariff disputes?
Well, Jill, firstly, Indonesia has long followed a foreign policy of non-alignment, especially when it comes to security, the economy and diplomacy. Jakarta prefers to stay neutral, steering clear of major power rivalries, especially between the United States and China. But that position is now being tested. The sweeping tariffs imposed by the US could push Indonesia to deepen its economic ties with China. Now, China has been Indonesia's largest trading partner for over a decade and is one of its top sources of foreign direct investment. Last year alone, trade between the two countries hit a record $150 billion, while Chinese investment rose by 9.4% to $8.1 billion. Now, with the US slapping a hefty 32% tariff on Indonesian exports, Jakarta may be rethinking its reliance on Washington as a key trading partner and looking more seriously at China and other markets. A high-level Indonesian delegation has been sent to the US to negotiate a resolution. In fact, Foreign Minister Suk Yeol was part of this delegation and had just met his US counterpart, Marco Rubio. But Jakarta is also reaching out to Beijing to explore ways to navigate Washington's tough trade stance together. The ongoing US-China trade tensions could present opportunities for Indonesia as global companies look to shift production out of China to avoid US tariffs. Indonesia could position itself as a new manufacturing hub. More Chinese investment could bring in advanced technologies and create jobs, boosting Indonesia's economy and integrating it deeper into the regional supply chain. But it's not all upside. As China looks to new markets for goods it can no longer sell to the US, Indonesia could face a wave of lower-priced Chinese imports. While that might benefit some Indonesian businesses and consumers with cheaper materials and components, it could also mean tougher competition for local industries, especially in sectors like electronics, textiles, and automotive parts. Jill.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen. My colleagues, Tanya Guan and Saiful Bari Ismail from Shanghai and Jakarta Live. Coming up on East Asia tonight, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance begins a 4-day visit to India amid tensions with China. New Delhi is looking to avoid steep U.S. tariffs with an early trade deal. This is East Asia Tonight. Here are the headlines we're following. Top Chinese and Indonesian officials hold their first ever joint diplomacy and defense talks in the Chinese capital. Beijing says it will work together with Jakarta to maintain the stability of industrial supply chains. South Korea says it has found increased attempts to disguise foreign products as Korean exports, primarily from China. It's seen as a bid by exporters to sidestep hefty tariffs. Pope Francis has died aged 88, this a day after making an appearance at St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday. Condolences and tributes from around the world and leaders are pouring in as they remember the pontiff's 12-year leadership of the Roman Catholic Church. Catholicism is believed to have begun nearly 2 millennia ago. Over the centuries, elaborate rituals were developed and refined. Pope Francis was known as a no-frills pope. He pared down some of the pomp and pageantry, and these included funeral rites. Some procedures, though, remain unchanged. Much of the responsibility falls on this man, Cardinal Kevin Joseph Farrell. Now, he is the church's current Camerlengo. Now, that's the Italian word for chamberlain. Now, he oversees the property and finances. He also formally confirms the Pope's death. Now, medically, of course, doctors would do that. But ceremonially, the Camerlengo calls out the pontiff's name 3 times over his body to check for any response. The death triggers 9 days of mourning. There is no autopsy as the church forbids it. Once the Camerlengo authorizes a death certificate, he will seal the papal apartment. This was the Camerlengo doing just that in 2005 after the death of Pope John Paul II. Now, traditionally, it was done to prevent looting of the Pope's quarters. For Pope Francis, his apartment was not in the papal palace, but a section of the more modest second floor of the Vatican City's guest house, Casa Santa Marta. Next, the Camerlengo removes Pope Francis's papal ring and destroys it. This is to symbolize the end of the late Pope's authority. It's also to prevent forgeries, as popes typically use the ring to seal and stamp documents. It's called the Ring of the Fisherman. It depicts St. Peter, a fisherman considered by the Church as the first pope. Pope Francis's ring was made of a gold-plated silver rather than pure gold, using an existing design instead of one specially created for him. Traditions dictate a list of people the Camerlengo must inform of the Pope's death. At the top, the Cardinal Vicar of Rome, for the Dean of the College of Cardinals, and that's followed by ambassadors of the Holy See, the head of nations. The funeral must take place between 4 and 6 days after death. Pope Francis simplified the rites. He has done away with a private viewing. The Pope's coffin will be taken straight to St. Peter's Basilica for the public to pay their respects. And instead of a triple-layer casket, his is single-layer wood, lined with zinc. It will not be placed on a raised platform. Now, instead of burial underneath St. Peter's Basilica, Pope Francis will be the first pontiff in a century to be interred away from the Vatican. He has requested to be buried at the Basilica of St. Mary Major in Rome. The senior official who helped make the changes said they emphasize the funeral is that of a shepherd and a disciple of Christ and not of a powerful man of the world. Now, within 2 to 3 weeks of the funeral, the search for a new pope begins with an electoral process known as the conclave. Until a successor is found, the Camerlengo and 2 other cardinals will be in charge of the church. Now, let's turn our focus back to East Asia in other news. South Korea's ousted President Yoon Suk Yeol attended the second hearing of his insurrection trial today. He is accused of leading an insurrection by imposing martial law in December. The court noted the high level of interest in the trial and allowed media to film the opening of today's session. Now, this marks the first time the former president is photographed in the defendant's seat. On the night of the emergency decree, Yoon denounced what he called anti-state liberals for abusing the legislative majority to block his agenda. 2 military officers have testified that they were instructed to drag out lawmakers from parliament to stop them from voting down the martial law. If convicted, Yoon could face life in prison or the death penalty. South Korea's leading presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung has pledged to eliminate the so-called Korea discount. Now, that term refers to the lower valuations that listed South Korean-listed companies typically trade on relative to their global peers. It's partly due to the dominance of family-owned conglomerates, which have been criticized for putting their interests ahead of other shareholders. Mr. Lee vows to curb abuses by controlling shareholders in order to boost the stock market and usher in what he calls the Korea Premium Era. The Liberal candidate hopes to double the value of South Korea's main stock index to woo the country's 14 million retail investors. Mr. Lee is the former leader of the opposition Democratic Party, which controls the parliament. Last month, lawmakers passed a bill requiring board members to protect the interests of minority shareholders. But acting President Han Duck-soo vetoed the legislation, saying it could impede management's decision-making. A poll released today shows Mr. Lee widening his lead among potential candidates. Over half of those surveyed picked him as their new leader. Former Labour Minister Kim Moon-soo from the Conservative People Power Party is a distant second at just over 12%. Well, US Vice President J.D. Vance has begun his 4-day trip to India as New Delhi looks to seal a trade deal to avoid Washington's sweeping tariffs. The visit also happening against the backdrop of an escalating trade war between the US and China. Mr. Vance landed in New Delhi a few hours ago and is set to meet Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The two are expected to review progress on the bilateral agenda, discuss when the Indian leader met President Donald Trump in Washington in February, and this includes what's been described as fairness in their trade relations, as well as growing their defense partnership. The US is threatening additional 26% duties on Indian goods if no deal is reached by the end of the 90-day pause. India is reportedly open to cutting tariffs on more than half of its imports from the US, and that's totaling almost $42 billion in 2024. Neha Punia tells us more about the US-India trade talks.
Whether it was Trump's first term or his second term, India's been very clear that it does not want a trade spat with one of its largest trading partners, which is why from the very beginning, since Trump walked into the White House, India has been talking about ways to get on the same page with the US on fixing this massive trade imbalance that's stacked heavily in New Delhi's favor. In the last few weeks, we've seen both sides make significant progress in identifying what the first tranche of this trade deal will look like. India says it'll be ready by October, but it's keen on making more progress to ensure that the modalities are agreed upon before this 90-day pause on tariffs is lifted. And we're given to understand that J.D. Vance, who's representing the Trump administration, will be raising this bilateral trade deal with Prime Minister Modi. He's expected to push India to buy more US defense equipment to try and bring that trade imbalance down. This is also important because Washington, D.C. has been trying to get New Delhi to pivot away from its traditional supplier of military gear, which is Russia. There's also going to be a discussion on allowing more market access for American firms and products. A key area of disagreement is the import of US agricultural products, something India has been resisting because it says that Indian farmers who farm for subsistence cannot compete with commercial farming that happens in the US. But it's certainly something that the US Vice President is going to push for. And, as the two leaders meet, there's also going to be nationwide protests that farmer unions are holding to protest that trade deal.
Still ahead on East Asia tonight, global shipping giant DHL suspends high-value shipments to the US as new rules make custom clearance a hassle. And US tariffs are hitting Asia's fourth biggest economy. South Korea's exports dropped 5.2% in April. Welcome back, everyone. Time for Roland Lim with the business news. And Roland, I'm looking at this story on China, who's seeking to channel exports to the US via South Korea.
That's right, Jill. South Korean authorities say they have found an increase in the activities aimed at using the country as a backdoor to dodge tariffs. I'll have more on that act of rerouting in a little bit. But first, another trust firm in China, AVIC Trust, is reportedly seeking help after delaying payments on some of its investment products. Now, just last week, it was the first state-owned trust company to be placed in custody, according to Bloomberg. AVIC Trust has more than $82 billion in assets under management, according to its website. The company's moves are the latest signs of problems rippling through the $3.7 billion trust industry in China, as authorities come to grips with the fallout from the property market. AVIC said on Friday that it entered a service agreement with SDIC Taikang Trust, as well as CCB Trust. Now, the two financial institutions, which are also state-owned, will handle the daily operations and management of the troubled entity. AVIC says its outstanding claims and debt remains unchanged. The latest developments follows the woes of what was one of China's largest shadow banks. Zhongrong International Trust is facing liquidation after its two custodians concluded the firm was insolvent. It missed payments on numerous wealth products. DHL is suspending high-value shipments bound for the U.S. as it grapples with delays in customs clearances amid Washington's new trade rules. The shipping giant says the temporary move will be effective for goods more than $800 delivered from businesses to individuals. Now, business-to-business shipments are not affected but could face delays. U.S. President Trump has imposed wide-ranging trade shakeups since assuming office to address Washington's trade deficits. And part of the move is a new requirement that goods above $800 will have to undergo tighter entry processing. Now, that is down from the previous $2,500 threshold. DHL's moves comes less than a week after Hong Kong Post announced it was halting all deliveries bound for the US, pledging not to collect any levies on behalf of the US. Japan has, for the first time in more than 2 decades, imported rice from South Korea as a chronic crunch in the supplies of the staple continues. Now, it imported about 2 tons of the grain, which has already been sold out. An additional 20 tons are scheduled to arrive by next week. Now, while the amount accounts for a sliver of Japan's consumption, it offers a bright spot for South Korea's overall exports. It also comes at a time when Asian countries are seeking to improve trade ties with each other to overcome Trump's efforts to upend the global trade. In an early reading of this month's trade in South Korea, data showing a dent in shipments from South Korea, suggesting the US levies are starting to hurt. Now, in the first 20 days of the month, exports fell 5.2% on year. Now, much of that is due to shipments to the US that's down 14%. Exports to China, which faces Washington's biggest tariffs, fell as well. But shipments to the EU increased. Exports of automobile and auto parts declined after a 25% tariff was imposed by the US. Semiconductor shipments gained ahead of expected levies on the sector. Now, the US has introduced 10% blanket tariffs this month, and South Korea has been slapped with 25% reciprocal levies, which are temporarily paused for 90 days. The Korean won strengthening at this hour against the US dollar. South Korea says it has found increased attempts to disguise foreign products as Korean exports, primarily from China. Now, that's to avoid US President Trump's sweeping tariffs. The Korea Customs Service conducted a special probe last month that revealed nearly $21 billion worth of violations related to country of origin in the first 3 months of the year. And 97% of those shipments were meant for the US. Now, that's significantly higher than the whole of last year. There were a total of some $24.5 billion worth of violations in 2024, out of which the US-bound shipments accounted for 62%. Now, Goldman Sachs estimates that Chinese exports worth around $120 billion bypassed tariffs in 2023. In the face of steep US tariffs on Chinese exports, South Korean officials are seeking to clamp down on the practice of rerouting.
저희가 이제 아무래도 위치상 중국이랑 가깝기 때문에 중국에서 이제 한국 경유해서 미국으로 가는 경우가 많은 것 같고, 또 중국뿐만 아니고 저 동남아 쪽에서도 충분히 이제 한국을 경유해서 갈 수 있기 때문에 그쪽으로도 좀 사건이 좀 발생할 가능성이 높다고 생각합니다.
And Roland is sitting down with me to understand more about the implications of this serious breach involving billions of won. Obviously, an attempt to bypass the US tariffs. Is it really, Roland? I mean, is there a clear line that the South Koreans are saying connecting the backdoor findings with the tariff policies introduced by President Trump? Or could there be other reasons?
There is a clear connection, Jill. South Korean's customs agency uncovered over $20 million worth of these violations in just the first quarter of this year alone. What's more alarming was that 97% of those goods were actually bound for the US. Now, Trump came into power in the month of January, so it's within that same period whereby he ratcheted up trade levies, 145% to China, 25% to South Korea, although that's been suspended for 90 days pending trade talks. So a lot of companies are actually using that 90 days to actually reroute stuff from Korea, from China, I should say, to Korea.
So there's that window of opportunity, so to speak. But how easy is it really to perpetrate this false labeling? Is it so easy or a bit more complicated?
It is actually quite surprisingly easy, because checks on these goods are quite lax. They are more, they're reliant because, first, South Korea has good export relations with the US. And secondly, China is very close to South Korea. So it's actually very easy and cheap to bring goods over from Korea to China. So there's the three main methods, one of which is, as I said, why easy? Well, there's first of all relabeling. So it's as simple as peeling off the made in China, sticking on made in Korea. Of course, you need documentation for that, but then again, documentation can be forged as well. Then there's the repackaging. So you take the product out of the made in China box, put it into a made in Korea box.
Right.
So that's another way.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, of course, there's the final products or the finished product. So all the parts that you need to make the goods, ship it from China, bring it to Korea, assemble it together, and then re-export it and say it's made in Korea. So it's that simple.
Wow. Now, I'm wondering, are there concerns that there could be broader implications if this pattern continues?
Well, there certainly is broader implications. I mean, the fact that we were talking about this news item is because there has been preemptive action by the South Korean customs official, and they had anticipated this because during the first Trump administration, there was also this slight trend happening. So it's obviously the South Korean side not wanting to preempt or not wanting to jeopardize the trade talks with the U.S. That's one thing. And also they've come together, U.S. customs officials and South Korean customs officials have come together to set up joint investigations. Seoul has set up a special task force to look into this. So they are now going to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of instead of having preemptive inspections rather than just waiting for U.S. side to initiate audits on shipments coming into the U.S.
Ah, I see. Okay, that makes sense. Now, I'm just wondering, is it a problem of country of origin fraud? Could it be, what I mean, is it prevalent elsewhere? Because we talked about this being also because of proximity between South Korea and China, making it flourish. So could it be a problem elsewhere?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not just a South Korean problem. It's actually a global problem. Yeah. And any country or economy that has lower levies than the U.S., well, that's going to be a target. And right now, the top three are Mexico, because of auto parts, as well as EV cars. Vietnam, which Trump has labeled a trade manipulator. It's a well-known transshipment hub for Chinese goods coming in and then being shipped out again. And then Malaysia has also come into the U.S.'s radar because it has chips, electronics, as well as solar equipment being rerouted from China, allegedly.
All right, so perhaps we haven't seen the back of this just yet. Thank you so much, Roland Lim, for that information. But it's over to you. Well, you're going to throw it back to me anyway,
yes,
so thank you so much. We want to go in just a couple of minutes, but we've got a couple of stories for you about events that took place in China over the weekend in case you missed it. For one, humanoid robots racing humans for the first time in a half marathon in Beijing. Dozens sprung off from the starting line, accompanied by human trainers. Speed, form and endurance, all key to winning. The 21-kilometre course was not all smooth sailing, though, posing a challenge to some. Thousands of curious human runners and spectators, meanwhile, lined up, phones in hand, ready to take pictures. Claiming victory out of 20 teams was Tiangong Ultra. Standing at about 1.8 meters tall, you see him there, weighing about 55 kilograms. Its time, 2 hours, 40 minutes and 42 seconds. Over in Shandong province, a whimsical wonderland as colourful kites took flight at the Weifang Kite Festival. The event, first held in 1984, is widely seen as the largest of its kind, attracting people from all around the world. Now, this year, at least 250 teams from 50 countries joined in the showcase. Well, that is it for East Asia Tonight. Don't forget your headlines anytime at CNA.Asia. We're also on Facebook and YouTube as well. Leaving you now with more pictures of that eye-catching kite festival.